Hi guys, today we are talking about complex and simple exercises. And when I think about complex and simple exercises, kind of comparing it to just some math problems is probably a pretty easy comparison. So our simple exercises would be maybe one or just a couple of joints that they're crossing over, and it's pretty isolated movements on pretty small muscle groups. So think about maybe a bicep curl, especially in perhaps a bicep curl machine, or a tricep push down, or a hamstring curl. Some of these movements that are just innervating one or maybe two joints, and the stress on the body is basically limited to a very specific muscle group. So those would be our simple exercises, and that's kind of like our more basic arithmetic, like we run into in the beginning of elementary school. And then as we graduate and we get older and our math skills improve, we end up with all kinds of, imaginary numbers and things like that on the chalkboard. And that's kind of how some of our complex exercises are. When we're talking about maybe the squat, the bench press, the deadlift, even the push-up. A lot of these movements that we've been doing our whole lives, I see a lot of people doing them poorly. So that's basically what we're going to do. Is we're going to talk about some of our bigger movements that maybe work the body from head to toe, and how we can use some simple exercises to help develop those and maybe break those movements down and get better at some of those bigger movements. And how and when to use each is we're going to talk about a little bit of everything regarding that. So as far as the who should be worried about their complex exercises compared to their simple exercises? I would say that anyone who's training should be aware of the pros and cons of complex or simple exercises. The complex movements do better mimic the real world, but only performing complex exercises can lead to plateaus in training after some time. So much like the lifter who starts squatting once or twice a week and sees great success in that for several months perhaps, well, eventually they're going to plateau, because remember, if we see I put that little chain image at the bottom of the slide here. Even if you're squatting all the time, if your movement selection is too narrow and you have a weak point or a weak link, sooner or later that weak link is going to be holding back your progress, and you'll just end up plateauing and kind of treading water. And in fact, as you try to progress, it's likely that you'll just start collecting injuries, just because there's some imbalance in your body, and you're not taking a step back away from the complex exercise and taking advantage of the power of the simple exercises to solve your weaknesses and help create the ability and the capacity for higher potential. And the downside of simple movements, while they are great for helping solve some of our weak links, simple movements in and of their own space do not carry over into the athletic space. And especially because they tend to focus on smaller muscles. So if I need athletes to be able to run and jump and change direction and make big plays, whether it's on a volleyball court, tennis court, in the pool for a water polo team maybe, or a more typical sport like a soccer, doing hamstring curls can help, but you're limiting the activity so that it's really not going to carry over as much as perhaps a squat or a hang clean or some type of deadlift variation. So both complex exercises and simple exercises have pros and cons, and we just want to learn how to use them in conjunction to help us achieve our goals. I would remind you all, let's not major in the minors. So let's not go to the gym a few days a week and just work on all of our little minor isolation muscles. Maybe you do want bigger biceps and bigger calves and better abs. If you're only doing isolated movements on those muscle groups, you're missing out on a whole lot of potential from the bigger movements. So even if you could care less, even if you're not an athlete and you just know you want bigger biceps, abs, and calves, yeah, you should probably do some bicep specific work, some ab specific work, and some calf specific work. But if you sprinkle in some of the bigger complex lifts, such as a squat, Well, there's benefits in that squatting pattern. They're going to bleed over into your original goals. So this is just an example here. So let's say we're squatting. Well, they found that in that squat pattern, when we are bracing, as we tend to lean forward just a little bit, and we're bracing, they did some electromyography research where they put some of the electrical pads on the body so that they can measure the amount of electrical activity occurring in the muscles. They found that in the rectus abdominis, which makes up our abs or our six pack, or that little turtle shell out in front. They found that the electrical activity, so therefore the muscular contractions occurring in the rectus abdominis, were greater during a barbell back squat than they were during a lot of other movements in comparison to some pretty traditional ones like sit-ups and leg lifts. So if you want abs, you might want to squat heavy. Now, as far as the biceps and the calves are going to get stressed under those heavy squats as well, as the ankle is having to create some stability. Biceps aren't going to get much work out of that back squat, but the way it will benefit is that a back squat or a heavy complex exercise of almost any type is going to stress the system to the degree that our bodies will actually release human growth hormone as well as testosterone in response to the trauma to help us recover. And once we release those hormones in the bloodstream, they're kind of up for grabs. So they're not just going to go to, okay, so let's say we back squatted. Let's say the trauma is really in the trunk and the legs. Well, when we release those hormones, they don't go directly to the trunk and legs. They're released in the bloodstream. So if we've done squats on one day and maybe some bicep work as well, or maybe we do biceps the next day or a couple of days later, those biceps can still reap the benefits of perhaps some heavy, stressful work that's come from a complex lift. So there is a little bit of there's a balance. There's a relationship between these complex and simple exercises. And what we're going to do today, and I guess there's probably an infinite number of exercises or movements that we could look at, but we're just going to look at 14 today and kind of talk about those. And then in our next two videos in this program, we're going to be back in the gym for activity days, and we'll be doing, we'll be getting into some movement patterns. So today we're going to go over the upper body push and pull, a couple of variations there, and we're going to go into the lower body push or knee dominant and pull or hip dominant exercises. And between those four sort of categories, we'll end up with 14 total movements today, and then we can move on and kind of dissect those a little bit more. And we'll be going into KPI exercises for each of those movement patterns as well. So not only talking about the big exercises, the big complex exercises, but how maybe some smaller, simple exercises can help feed into the success of those bigger complex exercises. Okay, so upper body, we're looking at horizontal pushes, and these two are essentially identical. I was actually involved in a research study, and as a subject, what we did was we tested the max bench press, and then in part of the study, they broke you into different groups, and they had you either perform a push-up protocol or a bench press protocol. And the push-up protocol, you would use whatever percentage of body weight was at in different angles, and you would add weight on your back, and that's how they would calculate your pressing load. So your push-up load was based off of your body weight with additional weight in relationship to a percentile of your max bench press. And the other group did their bench press protocols and workouts. And at the end of the research, we retested, and we tested in bench press and in weighted push-up and in a seated medicine ball chest pass toss. And the results from each group, the push-up protocol group that trained with push-ups and the bench press protocol group that trained with bench press, the results were nearly identical, showing that the push-up and the bench press are essentially as good as one another. So they're extremely similar, but we were looking for some horizontal options for pressing. And if you look at both of our lifters, some people might argue that these are vertical presses because our gal doing push-ups there is moving in a vertical space. And the same thing for our fellow doing bench press there. The bar is moving vertically. But really what we're doing is we're comparing that motion, that activity in relationship to the spine. So not in relationship to like the surface of the earth. But that gal doing push-ups, her arms are moving horizontally away from her spine. And the same thing for our male bench press example right there. So when you think upper body horizontal push, these would be two examples. And yes, there are machines and there's dumbbells and there's kettlebells and there's bands. That's all great. Those are included, but really we're just going to focus on kind of coaching and dissecting these two activities for today. So if those two exercises are sort of our bigger complex exercises, what are some simple movements we can do that might act as a KPI or a key performance indicator that by improving that simple exercise, our complex exercise might improve? So I included grip work, which could be, you can improve your grip work with farmer carries. So essentially just the activity of grabbing a couple of dumbbells and walking for distance. And the reason that grip work is actually going to help these movements improve, especially on the bench press, when you're getting under that bar and you squeeze it as tight as you can, that's causing an effect within your body. That increased tension is going to give you better control over the bar, but the increased tension will actually help us access more muscle within our body. Between our brain and our fingertips, we're going to be able to access more muscle because that's it's kind of causing a ripple effect of stress, is that the body knows to tense up when we're squeezing that bar as tight as we can. So a lot of times you see big bench pressers, take a look at their forearms. They've got, substantial forearms from squeezing that bar so tight. In fact, a lot of power lifters, and again, that powerlifting sport is the motion of the back squat, the bench press, and the deadlifts. A lot of power lifters will talk about how the bench press fatigues and exhausts and stresses out their grip and their forearms more than the deadlifts. So if you're bench pressing and you're just letting it rest there and sit there and even bend your wrist back, you're missing out on some pretty vital coaching cues and some benefit that could come out of squeezing that bar and riding your wrist into a neutral position. So if you want to increase your bench press, you would actually increase your grip work and maybe whether that's a farmer carry or a special machine or just kind of lifter's choice there. As far as the push-up, probably not as much as the bench press, but having increased grip is going to allow us to stabilize that wrist just a little bit more. And when you're doing those push-ups, you want to kind of turn your hands away as if you're just trying to twist that earth. So the grip work has a lot more to do with the bench press than the push-up, but it's still relevant within that push-up realm. As far as trap shrugs, your traps are going to act like an anchoring point for stability. On that bench press, your traps are going to be activated to help tighten up your scapula and create some stability on the backside as you're lowering that bar so that you don't flatten out, so you can stay tight on your backside. And they're going to stay that way as you press out. Same thing on push-ups. They're gonna fight any instability, and so we like trap shrugs to actually improve our horizontal presses. And then a little bit more linearly related would be tricep work, and that can come from push-ups or skull crushers or some type of close grip press. Get creative. The movement, not so much, you're already doing pressing, but you can step away from that pressing movement and do some elbow hinging and still grow those triceps pretty well. And that's just going to carry over into that elbow extension that occurs in both of our exercises there. And then we're also going to focus or include one of our KPIs for our glutes. So the glutes, glute bridge, or hip thrusts is going to help us create a more stable core and a base. And so on that bench press, you're almost doing a glute bridge. You don't want your hips to rise up off the bench. That sort of instability during the lifts is not ideal, but we want to kind of lock in, and we want to kind of be a statue from our upper back on the bench, and have our glutes touching the bench and our feet planted into the floor really well. So on that bench press, no, we don't want our hips to jump up at all, but we are going to be locked into place on the floor with our feet, and that's going to create tension all the way up through our upper back and into our hands. And on the push-up, having seen, I don't know, hundreds of people do hundreds of push-ups, I know that one of the biggest issues on the push-up is a soft core or an inactive core. So training glutes and glute bridges and hip thrusts is going to play a role in actually helping us do better push-ups. So our next two exercises, still in the upper body push umbrella. Now we're going vertical. So again, it's in relationship to the spine. Barbell overhead press and the one-arm landmine press. That landmine press, it's at a little bit of an angle, and you can kind of play around with that. If that lifter was to maybe go half kneeling, then the angle would be even sharper overhead instead of out in front of them a little bit. But even though it's at maybe a little bit of an incline, we're still going to label that as a vertical press. And this is not too much different from our horizontal movements of the push-up and the bench press. Grip work and farmer's carries will actually still help, especially now that we're doing an activity where we're standing up. Those farmer carries, if we go heavy enough, can actually start to challenge the core a little bit. So this overhead pressing is also going to challenge the core. And I'll tell you, when I'm doing really heavy landmine presses, one of my biggest lagging areas is my abdomen. I really feel it if I'm going slow and heavy on my landmine presses. My midsection will be talking to me and let me know I need to step it up in that department. So farmer carries can actually help us press better vertically. And same thing for trap shrugs. And trap shrugs, or the trap development, I guess, would actually have a better place with vertical pressing than even with horizontal pressing, because there's so much relevant stability that's going to occur, and even a contraction in that direction, that the connection is even stronger here. And again, tricep work with all that elbow extension, tricep work is there. And again, with glute work, same reasons as our horizontal pressing. But I would say even more so on the anterior core, so our rectus abdominis, and some great movements, some great variations there would be hollow holds, whether that, the hollow rock and any hollow rock variations. I would say with a barbell overhead press, for myself, or when I see athletes struggling, maybe they're doing a set of 10 and they sets one through 5 or 6 are just bang, 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 bang. And then they start slowing down on like 7 or 8. What I'll really see is I'll see their core start to melt a little bit. And if I can get in their ear, or if I'm the lifter on this particular set, if I really tighten up my glutes and flex my abdomen and kind of neutralize what my spine is doing, a lot of times I'll see that lifter regain confidence and feel good and knock out a couple of reps that are even better than their previous couple of reps. So I would say these exercises are very core dominant. So the more core work we do, the better we're going to be at some of this overhead pressing, especially if that is your weakness. If that's not your weakness, it's not going to be related quite as much. But as we grow as coaches and as lifters, we're going to start to identify weaknesses from our complex lifts, and that will help us determine what to do for our simple exercises. If I've got ridiculously great grip strength, doing more grip, and I've got a soft core or midsection, doing more grip strength is not going to help me out. I need to go address my weakness. About a For our upper body, let's move on to the pulling. And let's go horizontal pulling. So we've got the bent over row. I should probably change that slide a little bit because that gal is not very bent over. I let it slide, but it's not great. So she should probably get down a little bit lower. And again, her spine does not need to be horizontal, but the movement of the row should be horizontal in relationship from her arm in a relationship to her spine. So she's doing okay, but I would probably instruct her to either lower her chest a little bit or to guide the weight forward a little bit before it's coming back to create a little bit of movement of a movement that I like a little bit better. And then our second lifter is doing the inverted row. So it's a horizontal row using body weight. You can do it off of a barbell, off of a strap, whatever. And what's going to help boost or improve these two exercises? More grip work, being able to squeeze tight, low back work, especially for that bent over row. A lot of times it's that core that's going to start to melt first before your upper back. Even though your upper back is performing the work, that lower back in midsection is in an isometric hold the entire set. Some straight arm pull downs to grow the lats, bent over flies or rear delt flies or posterior delt work of any kind. And then back to anterior core again. So strong core will help set us up for success on both of these movements. I would say with the inverted row, I don't see the core melting as much on the inverted row as I do on the push-up. But I would say that the bent over row, probably the majority of people have a problem or have trouble getting into good positioning. They're just not comfortable with any kind of load down there. And so that's primarily, if I wanted to increase someone's bent over row capacity, the first thing I would do is give them extra core work. Still with upper body, still with pulling, this time moving to vertical. And again, it's the relationship of the arm action to the spine. And this one, there's not a lot of variation here. You could do one arm variations. We've got pull-ups and pull-downs. And there's some small differences between those two, but essentially the same movement. Okay, again, grip work, low back extensions. So why is that low back important? Well, the pull-up should actually include a little bit of a hold or bracing of the core. So when on that pull-up, you don't really want to see people's legs fall back under them and get that big old arch in the spine. And the same thing for pull-downs is you want to be strong enough. If you see our lifter on the bottom right, if you see our lifter on that pull-down, what happens on the pull-down when people start getting into weight that is challenging and heavy is they'll start swaying back and forth. They'll lean forward as the bar is high, and then they'll swing it back to get some momentum and cheat it back down there. So if we can get that lifter to stabilize their spine and work from that foundation, we can get a better set in. Now, that's mostly coaching because they're subconsciously kind of cheating and trying to get a little bit extra in. But often they're also actually just struggling because they're unable to brace right there. And then both of these exercises are highly dependent on the lats. And so an isolated movement that we could do would be straight arm pull downs to really smoke the lats. Another isolated movement would be reverse grip curls, something to attack the brachioradialis, which is a elbow flexor in your forearm. And then again, sort of similar to the straight arm pull down that isolates the lats, we would do pullovers with either a dumbbell or a barbell. Moving on to the lower body. Moving on to the lower body. We have front squats, back squats, and split squats. And this is for our lower body push or knee dominant. And yes, there are a million variations of them, of squats or knee dominant exercises. We could have included step ups. We could have included lunges. We're just trying to stick with some of the most basic and popular big movements here. That doesn't mean those other variations don't count or aren't involved, but we're just sticking to some of our most common or least common denominator, I guess you could say, kind of referring back to our math example from slide 1. And what's going to help us? What are some smaller movements or muscle groups that are going to help us increase our front, back, and split squats? Core stability. So when we are front squatting or back squatting or split squatting, I would say primarily front squat and back squat, what is the most common weak link? What is holding back most lifters from front or back squatting more weight than they are? And I would say that would be their core stability, their core strength. Because if you've ever been in a gym that has a squat rack and a leg press, you might notice that you can squat 200, 300, 500 pounds, whatever it is, and then you can walk over to the leg press and you can put that same amount of weight on the leg press, and you can do it for dozens of reps probably. So you could probably trip, sometimes depending on your machine, you can sometimes double or triple the amount of weight that you can do on the leg press compared to your squat, whether it's front squat or back squat. So your front squat and back squat, the limiting factor, it's not necessarily a leg exercise. The limiting factor is most often the core. So if you want to squat more, I would encourage you to boost your core strength. So core stability, really be thinking about those McGill 3 exercises that we did in warm-up day 1. Those be great for core stability. And then also under load, that lower back is going to be challenged and isolated. And if we keep squatting over and over again, particularly with the back squat, if we keep squatting over and over again without isolating that lower back and strengthening that lower back, we're going to plateau. There's no way around it. If that lower back becomes your weak link, it will remain your weak link unless we are taking a step back to insert simple exercises that are going to challenge it and strengthen it. Another isolated or simpler movement, you could argue that this one is complex. There's some gray area with that, as with most things. Would be glutes, glute bridges, hip thrusts. So looking at our squatters on the front squat, back squat in particular, you can see at the top of the squat, their hips are over their feet. At the bottom of the squat, their hips are back behind their feet. So what they're doing essentially is they're glute bridging up. If that's their booty on the back of my hand right there, if my knuckle is kind of like their butt cheek a little bit, as they're hinging backwards to come back forward, they're essentially performing a glute bridge or a hip thrust. So you're not only mimicking the motion a little bit, but you're really, really isolating those muscles that are going to help drive you out of the hole when you're way deep in that squat. Trap shrug. How did the trap shrug get back in here? Well, just like the traps are involved in some of our upper body pressing movements, they're also involved in that scapular retraction and support that's necessary for racking and supporting weights on the front squat. So for anyone who's ever wrestled before, head control is an important factor. And for the brief period of time that I wrestled and was getting my butt kicked, I was told that, where the head goes, the body follows. So if we're weak in our upper back and our traps, and we start breaking down, whether it's on the front squat or the back squat, as that breaks down and kind of melts, and maybe our head dips forward, where the head goes, the body follows. And then hamstring curls. Hamstring curls are going to be important on this for at least 2 reasons. I'll start there and we'll see if I do a tangent onto more reasons. But at least 2 reasons. One is that they're not a mirror muscle. So our mirror muscles are the muscles we see in the mirror. So when we're getting ready to take a shower and we're in our towel or whatever, and we can see the pecs and the abs and the biceps and the quads, those are muscles we really think about. So we tend to neglect triceps and back and hamstrings and the posterior chain, calves and hamstrings. So hamstring curls are going to be important for that because they're probably neglected. They're more likely to be part of the weak link than would say your quads. I rarely see someone whose quads are the limiting factor in a complex lift. On the front squat, the hamstrings aren't going to play the biggest role, but they do get activated at the very bottom of that squat. And the same thing for the back squat. On the back squat, the hamstrings are going to get challenged a little bit more even. Again, could possibly be our limiting factor pretty easily. And then your split squat, it kind of depends how you do that split squat. And we're going to go more into this when we're doing demonstrations of the split squat in the future. But that split squat, if you're coming down and you are loading your weight up towards the toe a little bit, you're going to get a lot of quad activation. But as you're lowering into that split squat, if you rotate towards the knee just a little bit, whatever foot's out front, so if my left foot is out front, as I come down, I'm going to rotate just a hair over to that left knee. And as I come back up, I'm going to straighten out. If I'm performing a motion like that, I'm going to get a whole lot more posterior chain activation in my glute and my hamstring on that left leg. So there's some nuances and techniques in how you're doing it and what muscles are going to get picked on. Lower body pull or hip dominant. Our three big movements here are all pretty similar. We're going to talk about the deadlift, the Romania deadlift, and the good morning. And what we're doing here is basically hinging, and we're challenging our midsection, our core, and our posterior chain, our calves, our hamstrings, and our glutes. And because those are the muscles that we're challenging, it's pretty easy at this point. You guys should almost not even need this at this point, but we're just going to knock it out real quick. What are some simple exercises or muscle groups that we could focus on and dial in to help with these three exercises? Well, we do core stability. At this point, we know that core stability is huge, paramount. Lower back pain is the number 2 reason that Americans go to the doctor. So we're doing core stability like the McGill 3 exercises. We're doing low back specific exercises such as back extensions, and I'm being very tentative with that, but we want to make sure that our lower backs are extremely strong, and that's going to help resolve any weaknesses we have that might be holding us back on the deadlift, Romanian deadlift, and good morning. Again, with glute bridges, hip thrusts. So the glute bridge and hip thrust is involved in the squat to a certain degree, but it is heavily involved and heavily mimics the lower body pull activity. And it can also be done in different ways. So if the glute bridges are done with the feet closer in, you're going to get a little bit more quad activation. And if the feet are further away, you're going to get a little bit more posterior chain activation. Trap shrugs. I went on to a pretty good spiel a couple of slides back on that. But especially now that we're actually holding that bar out in front of us on a couple of these exercises, traps, the importance of traps goes up even more. Hamstring curls, again, the quads are rarely the limiting factor. So just keep in mind that picking on those hamstrings a little bit extra is not a bad idea. And then with these three, the way that weight is loaded and challenging us, remember that where the head goes, the body follows. So if we're supposed to be having tight scapulas and they melt out away from us, and that's going to start to drag down the top of our spine, our head, all that good stuff, and the body will probably follow. And that's not good for any of these 3 lifts. Okay, when or how should we sort of be deciding or determining how to use these complex or simple exercises? And probably the first thing that I want to bring up is that there's a very different neurological effect on the body from a big back squat day compared to a big bicep curl day. And with those complex exercises like a back squat or a deadlift or a bench press or a hang clean or some kind of variation of that, there was a researcher who did, by the name of Prelpin, who did research regarding weightlifters and the number of lifts that they were doing and what intensity the lifts were at and how successful they were in training that day and training long term. And so we have Prelpin's chart. And this is relating the lifters' reps, the intensity of their reps compared to their 1 rep max. And he created optimal rep zones and suggestions for reps per set. And so by looking at this chart, we start to get an idea that if I'm training at 60% of my 1 RM, I'm going to be in that first column. And my optimal reps for the day are 24 reps. So I might want to train somewhere in that range. And so I might do 4 sets of 6 at 60%. And similar, if I'm training at 75%, my optimal reps for the day are 18 reps. And so what I might do is at 75%, I might do 3 sets of 6 at 75%. And at 85%, my optimal range is at 15 reps. And with my reps per set, what I might do is 3 sets of 5 at 85%. And there's some nuance here. They're not all 3 of those days would be equally challenging. So 3 sets of 5 at 85% would be really redlining it. So I will just say that with a caveat of that is that maybe 5 sets of 3 at 85% would be a little bit better. But then you look at the chart again and you see reps per set is 2 to 4. Yeah, okay, 5 sets of 3 is kind of falls within that range. So maybe at 85%, we do 5 sets of 3. And then if we're going 90% or above, our optimal reps fall at 7 reps. And at reps per set, we're doing 1 to 2 reps. So for success, on that day, we might do 5 sets of 1 at 90%. And this is a starting point. This is not the end all be all, but this is a starting point with our CNS because our central nervous system gets fatigued when we're doing heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, heavy hang cleans, heavy bench press. But if we've got a bicep arm pump day, we are not going to follow the same restrictions, and we're open to kind of pick on the muscles a little bit more because that central nervous system fatigue is not going to be the same. Instead of squatting a couple 100 pounds, you might be curling probably less than 100 pounds for typical athletes, but the CNS fatigue that takes place during complex lifts that are using multiple joints, where there's stress on the spine. Remember that our central nervous system is our brain in our skull and our spinal cord in our spine. So when we load our spine, we can expect an increase in stress to the nervous system because of all the localized musculature and activity that's happening near that spine. So keep in mind that we need to be a little bit conservative and have a little bit more tact with our complex lifts. And this is one of the charts that we'll refer back to going forward. And then, so that's sort of our big picture. Keep in mind that your CNS fatigue comes into play more so with our complex lifts. And then with our other lifts, like during a given day, you might be conservative and tactful, have a little bit more tact with your bigger complex lifts that occur in the beginning of the lift. So if we've got a day of lifting here, That's a poorly drawn sort of line graph there. So we might do some of our power exercises here, and our power, and that's probably going to be around, let's say 3 reps per set over here. And then as we move on, we might do a strength movement here. Here is some poor writing. And maybe on a given day, we're doing sets of 5 on our strength day, on our strength section, excuse me. And then as we get into some of our simpler movements, so maybe we did like hang cleans here, and we're doing bench press here. But as we move into some of the accessory movements, we might start training hypertrophy a little bit more. And so we might increase our reps there. And maybe at the end, again, bigger muscles and bigger complex exercises require less volume of training because of this, because of the stress that takes place on the system. As we move into smaller groups, like we can go out and do heavy calf raises for a couple sets of 40 or 50 or whatever we want to do. And you might get some sore calves, but it's not necessarily going to stress your nervous system out very much. Or calves, or like a lot of ab work, yeah, that's not going to necessarily stress out your nervous system so much. And so we might even, in a given day, we might even end up doing sort of some endurance type reps in rep ranges of 25. So there's a poorly drawn scale, but on a given day, you might do something along those lines. So the more complex it is, the lower in reps and the more conservative and tactical approach you might have. And then as you decrease the joints and the muscle groups involved, you are free to be a little bit meaner and pick on a little bit more with a little bit less concern for long-term central nervous system fatigue. And just a reminder, kind of looking at that poorly drawn chart right there. We'll head back to our chart right here. Again, none of, for the hypertrophy and for the endurance work that might be going on at the end of a lift, that stuff doesn't fit into our Prillipens chart. There's a time and a place for using that. And it's not with our smaller isolated movements. Your tricep pushdowns and your jump rope reps don't fall into Prillipens chart. Training, okay, so training phases. So we try to use these KPIs, these smaller exercises, to develop our bigger exercises. So if we know what our weakness is, we prioritize training the weakness. So if in one phase of training, for squatting, if in one phase of training you're getting a sore back, commonly getting a sore back, what you might do is prioritize core stability and low back strengthening. So you don't avoid the problem, you actually go towards it with a tactical approach. You're not trying to hurt the lower back, but you are trying to challenge it to make it grow. And let's say you get to the point that core stability and that core strength is no longer the issue, and you're finding that during your squat workouts or squat training, you're actually having trouble, you're getting out of the bottom sticking position, and as you're coming up, you're feeling that you're not getting enough drive out of your hips. So now, instead of doing a bunch of core stability work, on the next phase of training, you might increase your hip work. So you might increase glute bridges or hip thrusts or glute ham raises or sled drags. And that's how you're constantly kind of following and chasing your weaknesses. And then let's say for training on off days, it's okay to have days where you don't lift weights or don't go out and train. In fact, those rest days are actually when we grow and when we improve the most. But what you might have is you might have a few lifts a week that are big, and you've got the the squat in there, or the deadlift, or a big heavy hang clean, or a big old bench press. And those days are stressful to the central nervous system. But you might have some days where you go to the gym and you just kind of hit a few muscles here and there. So in that case, you might go in and you might pick on your weak points a little bit more again, depending on the balance of some of the things that are going on throughout that training block. So again, we prioritize our weaknesses and we train them until they're no longer the weakness, until you have a new weakness. And another reason why you might rotate or learn a better way to balance and utilize complex versus simple exercises is an injury. So if I've got somebody with a lower back injury, instead of having a front squat or back squat, I might say, hey, can you do a split squat? How about a step up? How about a lunge? And so I can still get my squat pattern in, but I'm maybe working around that lower back injury that they're dealing with. Or what about equipment? So again, if you want everybody on this team to do dumbbell bench pressing, because you think you want to get them stronger, and you're a fan of that motor pattern, and you think bench pressing is stupid and overrated, you might have great rationale, might have great support. Everybody might be on board for that. But if you don't have the right dumbbells, the right duplicate dumbbells for a team of quite a few athletes with similar strength levels, then that lift isn't logistically going to take place. If I'm training my female soccer team and I've got a dozen girls that want to do their bench press with 40 pounders that day, we'll be sitting there all day. We'll come in, we'll warm up, and then we'll only get like dumbbell bench pressing in, and that would be almost a waste of a workout. So while I don't think that bench pressing is the most important thing for a female soccer team, if I want them to get some upper body pressing in besides a push up to do something for a variation, I might have them bench press and I might send them to the bar. So that would be my goal. That would be how I would work it out. And then if I don't have enough barbells to get the job done, or I can't get into a squat rack that day, we're probably going to do push-ups. So I'm using the same principle. I'm using horizontal pressing. With the dumbbells, we didn't have enough dumbbells, so we were going to do a barbell for the bench press, and then we couldn't get into the racks, so we did push-ups. So when you know why you're doing what you're trying to do, you can just roll through different methods. And then preference. Okay, so maybe I have, maybe I have an athlete who is incredibly strong and great at the bench press, but they prefer dumbbells. They say it makes them feel a little bit better, and they think it's a little bit more applicable to their sport. So maybe I've got a wrestler who just really wants to do the dumbbell pressing. Well, if they're working really hard and they're getting better at it, and it's helping them get better, do I want to fight them and argue about it? Maybe that's kind of like some of the coaching and nitty gritty. But when we're just talking about the anatomy and physiology, if they're getting out of their dumbbell work what they want, and I'm getting what I want, then I might just be happy with that. And then sometimes you do different things just because they're kind of trendy or there's a phase going on. So up until a few years ago, not a few years, I guess, up until about 5 years ago, I was a huge proponent of the back squat and the front squat. And then I started really experimenting with split squats and rear foot elevated split squats and challenging heavy step ups. And I noticed all the benefits of it. It's more applicable to sport play. It's safer for athletes with injuries. If they've got a core injury, they can still kind of do those movements because there's so much less weight on the bar because you're only using one leg. And then if they have a leg injury, a lot of times they can still train heavily or near normally on their good leg, and then they can do some rehab activity on their other leg. So we all go through trends and phases and kind of what we want as well. So there's many reasons to why we might choose certain complex exercises versus simple exercises. And hopefully this is helping you guys understand why different exercises have different benefits and how they can work together. Great. We will see you next time.